Welcome back to Empowerment with Dr. Lawrence. I am your host, Dr. Lawrence. I realize that you have a choice in how you spend the next 30 minutes to an hour. So wherever you're consuming this, however you're consuming this, thanks for making us a part of your day. Look, last time we began with one simple statement. Everyone's performing, not everyone's performing well. That statement has become the foundation of everything we're discussing in this series because performance isn't reserved for athletes, musicians, executives, and people standing on the stage. Performance is about your life in motion. It's how you show up when you're tired. It's how you respond when you're criticized. It's the quality of your leadership. It's the consistency of your decisions. It's how you parent. It's how you communicate, how you solve problems, handle conflict. How do you recover from disappointment? Every single day, every one of us is producing an output. So everyone's performing. The only question is whether our performance reflects our true capacity or whether something is quietly suppressing it. Last week, we talked about identity capacity. We asked one fundamental question. Who do I believe that I am? Because people tend to perform in ways that align with their identity. So today I want to ask a different question, one that every one of us has wrestled with. Who is leading your life? Now, before you answer too quickly, let me explain what I mean. Have you ever said something you immediately wish you could take back? Of course you have. Come on now. Have you ever sent an email too quickly? Guilty. Have you made a purchase that you regretted? You walked away from an opportunity because of fear. It told you that you couldn't handle it. You avoided a difficult conversation because you were uncomfortable. Did you stay in a relationship longer than you should have because you were worried about being lonely more than the dysfunction? Every one of us has made decisions like that. And afterwards, we've said something interesting. I don't know what I was thinking, but maybe that wasn't the problem. Maybe you weren't thinking. Maybe you were feeling. There's a difference. So today we're going to talk about emotional capacity, not emotions. I mean, everybody has emotions. We're going to talk about your capacity to lead yourself when emotions become intense, because emotions are not the enemy. They're part of being human. The problem begins when our emotions become our decision makers. I think one of the greatest misconceptions in our culture is that successful people somehow experience fewer emotions than everyone else. That's not true. Successful people experience fear. They experience disappointment, grief, frustration, anxiety. They experience uncertainty. The difference is that they don't feel. The difference is they don't allow every feeling to become a command. So think about that. Every day your emotions are making suggestions. You should quit. Don't say anything. They don't really appreciate you. You're going to fail. You're probably going to fail. You're not good enough. You should give up. Take the easy way. Those thoughts arrive. They're wrapped in emotion. And because they arrive wrapped in emotion, they feel true. But feeling true and being true are not the same thing. That distinction has changed the way I think about leadership, business, my faith, and performance. Years ago, while I was leading my organization, I found myself facing a difficult personal decision. And if you've ever led people, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The facts were clear. The decision itself wasn't complicated, but emotionally it was incredibly difficult. I knew the people would be disappointed. I knew someone might get angry. I knew that there probably be some level of misunderstanding. I remember sitting alone in my office thinking through every possible outcome. Not because I didn't know what needed to happen, because I didn't enjoy the emotional weight that was attached to it. Some of life's hardest decisions aren't intellectually difficult. They're emotionally expensive. There's a difference. Most leadership decisions aren't hard because we don't know the right answer. They're hard because the right answer cost us something emotionally. Maybe it costs us approval or some level of comfort. Maybe it costs us some certainty or popularity. That's big these days. Maybe it costs us a relationship. Leadership often requires us to absorb emotional discomfort in order to protect something greater. The realization changed the way I understood the emotional capacity. It's not about becoming emotionally detached. It's about becoming emotionally dependable. People should be able to depend on you even when your emotions fluctuate, because they're going to fluctuate. You're human. I think one of the greatest gifts God gave us is the ability to experience emotion. Joy reminds us to celebrate, and grief reminds us that something mattered. Fear alerts us to danger. Anger tells us that something may be unjust, and your compassion moves us towards people that are hurting. So emotion isn't the problem. It's just information. The challenge in that information isn't always instruction. Let me say that again. Emotion is information. It isn't always instruction. Fear may tell you that something feels dangerous. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is. Anger may tell you that something feels unfair. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're seeing the situation clearly. Discouragement may tell you that something feels hopeless. That doesn't mean hope no longer exists. So, emotions communicate, but they don't always interpret reality accurately. That's why emotional capacity matters. Look, as a psychologist, I've become fascinated with one simple observation. Two people can experience the same event and have completely different emotional responses. One person loses a job and sees an opportunity. I get to go out and change the world. Another loses a job and sees the end of their future. One entrepreneur hears no from an investor and immediately starts refining the business. Another hears the same word and quietly gives up on the dream. An athlete loses a championship and becomes more determined. Another just, never competes the same way again. The event wasn't the deciding factor. The emotional interpretation was. That's important because most of us spend our lives trying to change circumstances while ignoring the way we interpret them. And interpretation drives performance. When I served in the Army, there was something that we all understood. Pressure changes people, or at least that's what most people believe. I don't think pressure really changes people. I think pressure reveals people because pressure exposes your preparation. It exposes your discipline, your leadership, your character. Pressure exposes your emotional capacity. You don't just suddenly become courageous when the pressure arrives. You discover whether courage was already being developed long before the pressure showed up. The same thing happens in business. It's easy to lead when everything is going well. It's easy to have faith when the future looks certain. It's easy to be patient when life is cooperating. The real test comes when circumstances refuse to cooperate, when the economy shifts, when someone you trust disappoints you, when the diagnosis isn't what you hope for, when the business loses a major client, when your child makes a decision that you never expected, when life becomes emotionally expensive. That's when emotional capacity begins to matter, because in those moments, your emotions begin to make very loud suggestions like quit, fight, run, hide, blame someone, protect yourself. If we're honest, every one of us has heard those voices. So the question isn't whether you hear them. The question is whether they'll become your leader. One of the reasons I believe so many people become emotionally exhausted isn't because life is difficult. Life has always been difficult. People become emotionally exhausted because they're asking their emotions to do something emotions were never designed to do. They're asking emotions to provide direction. Emotions were never meant to replace values. They were never meant to replace wisdom. They were never meant to replace conviction. They were never meant to replace purpose. They're indicators, not commanders. Imagine driving across the country. The dashboard lights are important. If the fuel light comes on, you better pay attention. If the engine temperature rises, you better pay attention. If the tire pressure warning appears, guess what? You better pay attention. But imagine letting the dashboard steer the car. That would be absurd. The dashboard provides information. The driver produces the direction. So your emotional function, if your emotions function the same way, they deserve your attention. They shouldn't automatically receive your obedience. And I think that's one of the defining characteristics of emotionally healthy people. They acknowledge what they feel without surrendering control to their lives by every feeling that they experience. That brings us to a definition I want you to remember. Emotional capacity is your ability to experience emotion without allowing emotion to determine your performance. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't say suppress emotion. I didn't say ignore your emotions or pretend that they don't exist. Healthy people don't deny emotion. Healthy people learn to lead through the emotion. That's emotional capacity. And just like identity capacity, it can be strengthened. It can grow. It can become one of the greatest assets you possess. But first, you have to recognize who's been leading your decision. So we're going to begin there. So let's take this one step further. Earlier, I said that emotional capacity isn't about eliminating emotion. It's about increasing your capacity to carry emotion without allowing it to determine your behavior. That raises another question. What exactly is capacity? Because we're going to use that word throughout this series. When I talk capacity, I'm talking about the depth at which an individual can hold something before it changes the quality of their performance. So think about that for a moment. Every one of us has a different emotional container. Some people can carry enormous disappointment and continue leading with wisdom. Others experience one unexpected setback and immediately begin making decisions that they later regret. The difference isn't the disappointment. The difference is the size of the container. The difference is capacity. Imagine I handed two people the same weight. One person carries it with very little effort. The other begins shaking almost immediately. The weight's identical. The strength of the person carrying it is different. So life works the same way. Every one of us carries emotional weight. The loss of someone we love, financial uncertainty, conflict, failure, criticism, fear. Things like loneliness, stress, disappointment, none of us escape those experiences. The question isn't whether life will become emotionally heavy. The question is whether our capacity is large enough to carry that weight without abandoning purpose. That's emotional capacity. One of the biggest mistakes I think people make is assuming that emotions themselves are the problem. They're not. They're gifts. Like, think about it. They're indicators. They're telling you that something inside you deserves a deeper look. Think about the dashboard in your car. When the fuel light comes on, it's telling you something. When the engine temperatures begin to rise, it's telling you something. When your tire pressure warning light comes on, it's telling you something. Those indicators aren't the problem. They're invitations to investigate the problem. And your emotions work the exact same way. Fear tells you that something deserves your attention. You better pay attention. Anger tells you that something's feel violated. Sadness tells you that something matters. Joy tells you something is meaningful. Anxiety tells us that your mind perceives uncertainty. Every emotion is communicating, but communication isn't command. That's what so many people get into trouble. Instead of asking, what is this emotion trying to tell me? They immediately ask, what should I do? Because I feel like this. Those are two completely different questions. One produces wisdom. The other one produces regret. The emotion is simply saying, look, something deserves a deeper look. That's all. It isn't telling you to quit. It isn't telling you to leave. It isn't telling you to retaliate. It isn't telling you to give up. It's just simply raising its hand and saying, hey, man, you should pay attention. So healthy people learn to investigate. Unhealthy people react. Last week, I spent a great deal of time thinking about the difference between the grasshopper and ant. It took me back to a story that my grandfather, we actually experienced. At first glance, they both simply, they're just insects on the ground, right? But the more I studied them, the more I realized that they represent two completely different approaches to life. The grasshopper doesn't jump toward a destination. It jumps away from a stimulus. Something startles it and it jumps. It doesn't stop to ask, hey, where am I going? That next, will this move me closer to where I ultimately want to be? It only knows one thing. I don't want to be here anymore. So it jumps again and again and again. Not because it has a plan, because it wanted relief. Now think about how many people live life exactly that way. Someone criticizes them, so they quit. Business gets difficult, so they quit. Marriage becomes painful. They emotionally check out. Leadership becomes uncomfortable. They resign. Your life's going to get stressful. Some people escape. Some people escape through spending. Some escape through food. Some use alcohol, pornography, doom scrolling. Others bury themselves in work. I've been guilty of that. The method changes, but the pattern doesn't. They're jumping, not because they know where they're going, because they desperately want to get away from where they are. That's what low capacity looks like. Low emotional capacity doesn't always produce a dramatic emotional outburst. Sometimes it simply just produces a constant emotional movement. Always changing jobs, always changing churches, always changing relationships, always changing your goals, always looking for relief. Never asking whether the next jump actually moves them towards purpose. So life becomes reaction after reaction after reaction. Eventually, they mistake movement for progress. The movement isn't always progress. Sometimes it's simply another jump. Now shift gears. Let's talk about the ant. The ant doesn't wake up every morning wondering how it feels. It moves with purpose. It carries weight. It keeps building. It keeps preparing. It understands something that the grasshopper never learns. That temporary discomfort is often the price of a meaningful future. That's emotional capacity. The ability to remain committed to purpose even when emotion is asking for immediate relief. One life is directed by the stimulus. The other is directed by mission. One asks, how do I escape this feeling? The other one asks, what does my purpose require of me right now? That's a completely different way to live. And it's the difference between reacting to life or leading your life. I want you to notice something. Low emotional capacity doesn't necessarily mean someone feels more emotion. It just means that they can hold less emotion before their behavior changes. And that's important because two people may experience the same amount of fear. One continues moving forward toward their purpose. The other one abandons it. Two people experience the same criticism. One learns and one retaliates. Two people experience the same disappointment. One's going to grow. The other one's going to give up. The emotion was never the determining factor. The capacity was. That's why I don't spend my time trying to help people eliminate emotions. First of all, that's impossible. My question tends to be much different. How can emotion carry you before it changes who you become? Because that's the question that determines performance. And remember, everyone's performing, but not everyone's performing well. Do you want to go deeper? I want you to join my community where we will explore what I call operational performance. To be clear, this isn't therapy. This is training. I want you to perform better. So to get started, click the link below and then look for Performance Matter. Register and I'll see you soon. At this point, some of you may be asking a very practical question. If emotional capacity is so important, can it actually grow? And I believe the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, I don't believe emotional capacity is something you're born with. I believe it's something you build, just like physical strength, just like leadership, just like wisdom, like trust. Capacity grows under the right conditions. But here's the challenge. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid the very experiences that increases their capacity. So think about physical exercise for a moment. When you walk into the gym, the goal isn't to avoid the resistance. The resistance, that's the workout. Without resistance, there is no growth. Without strain, there's no strength. Without challenge, there's no adaptation. Yet emotionally, we tend to live life in exactly the opposite way. We spend enormous amounts of energy trying to eliminate discomfort. We avoid difficult conversations. We postpone hard decisions. We escape uncertainty. We distract ourselves from grief. We numb disappointment. We run from anxiety. In other words, we avoid emotional resistance, then wonder why our emotional capacity never increases. The very thing we're trying to escape is often the thing that makes us stronger. One of the greatest misconceptions about emotional capacity is that emotionally healthy people somehow experience less stress. They don't. In many cases, they carry more. They carry more responsibility. They carry more difficult decisions, more uncertainty. They carry more sacrifice, more pressure. The difference isn't about what they carry or the amount that they carry. The difference is that over time, they've increased their capacity to carry it. So think about people that you admire. I always talk about my grandfather. He's a great leader. Think about your great leaders. A coach, maybe a pastor. An entrepreneur that you admire. Do they have the easiest lives? Usually not. In anything, if anything, they have greater responsibility. The reason they continue moving forward isn't because life became lighter. It's because they became stronger. Their container became larger. I think that's one of the reasons many people burn out. So before we define burnout under the lens of emotional capacity, I have a question for you. Have you ever seen anyone burn out doing what they love to do? Let that sit. Let's sit over that for a minute. Back to our regularly scheduled program now. Burnout isn't always the result of too much work. Sometimes it's the result of carrying more than your current capacity allows. There's an important distinction there. Two people can carry the exact same workload. One thrives, another collapses. Work isn't that difficult. The capacity is. That's what I don't spend time asking people, how do we make life easier? Life isn't always going to cooperate, guys. The better question is, how do we become capable of carrying more without sacrificing who we are? But let me ask you something that may surprise you. I don't believe avoiding difficult emotions protects you. I think it weakens you. Okay. Every emotion you refuse to process eventually demands more attention somewhere else. Unresolved anger shows up in your relationships. Unprocessed grief shows up in your motivation. Ignored anxiety shows up in your body. Hidden resentment often shows up in your leadership. Emotions don't disappear simply because we ignore them. They just relocate. That's why emotional capacity isn't about suppressing the emotion. It's about creating enough space to experience emotion without being controlled by it. One of the greatest builders of emotional capacity is recovery. I didn't say escape. I said recovery. Those are two completely different things. Escape avoids reality. Recovery prepares you to return to reality. There's a difference. Watching television for 6 hours because you don't want to think about something, that's escapism. Taking a walk, praying, spending time with your family, getting quality sleep, exercising, reading scripture, or sitting quietly to reflect, those things restore you. They increase your ability to return to life with clarity. Recovery doesn't remove responsibility. It just prepares you for it. And if you never recover, eventually every emotion feels heavier than it actually is. Another builder of emotional capacity is intentional discomfort. This one has changed the way I think about personal growth. I believe every person should regularly choose activities that require them to become comfortable being uncomfortable. Exercise on cold mornings. Have difficult conversations. Learn a new skill. Do some public speaking. Start by reading to kids. That's a great way to stop that. It's funny. One of the I guess most common fears is public reading. Well, go read to some kids. They probably won't even understand what you're saying. They just like to be out of class and they don't have to have nap time. So, you have opportunities here. This isn't be difficult. Why don't you try apologizing when you're wrong? Having conversations that you've been avoiding. These experiences aren't simply building discipline. They're expanding your emotional container. Every time you remain present inside of discomfort instead of escaping it, your capacity grows. Eventually, the things that once overwhelmed you become manageable because not because life changed, but because you changed. My faith has taught me something very important about emotional capacity. God rarely removes every difficult emotion before asking us to move. Think about the people throughout Scripture. Noah built an ark while everybody mocked him. Moses led while he was doubting himself. Joshua entered the promised land after repeatedly hearing, "Be strong and courageous." To hear "be strong and courageous," that means that you're facing some pretty daunting things. For the creator of the universe to tell you, hey, chill out, just be strong. I got you. That means you're facing something, So if you think about how he felt, how many times have we faced something that would seem way bigger than us? Okay, that was an emotion. So other examples, David spent years waiting before becoming king. Paul continued his mission despite imprisonment, persecution, and hardship. If Paul grew up in today's society and he made one post that somebody didn't like, his ministry would be over. It would change world events as we know it. But but think of his emotional capacity. Their emotions didn't disappear. Their purpose became greater than their emotions. That's a pattern worth paying attention to. So faith doesn't eliminate emotion. Faith enlarges your capacity to carry it. I've learned that emotional capacity grows through repetition, not dramatic moments, daily moments, choosing patience just one more time, choosing forgiveness just one more time, choosing discipline just one more time, choosing purpose just one more time. Every one of those decisions expands the container. Every one of those makes the next decision just a little bit easier. One day you realize something remarkable. The situation that once overwhelmed you, it doesn't anymore. Not because it became easier, because you became stronger. So let me ask you a question. What have you been running from? Not because you're weak, because you're uncomfortable. Is there a conversation you've been avoiding? Is there a responsibility that you've been postponing? Is there a decision that you've been delaying? A disappointment that you've refused to process? What if the very thing isn't standing in the way of your growth? What if it's the pathway to it? Because every time you choose purpose over relief, every time you remain present instead of escaping, every time you sit with an emotion long enough to understand what it's trying to tell you, your emotional capacity increases. And as it increases, your performance changes. Not because life becomes easier, but because you become larger than the emotion that once controlled you. And that's what we're after. not emotional suppression, not emotional perfection, emotional capacity, the ability to carry more without abandoning your purpose. And when that begins to happen, you'll discover something remarkable. Your circumstances don't have to change nearly as much as you thought. Sometimes the greatest change is the one that happens within the person carrying them. Do you want to go deeper? I want you to join my community where we will explore what I call operational performance. To be clear, this isn't therapy. This is training. I want you to perform better. So to get started, click the link below and then look for Performance Matter. Register and I'll see you soon. Last week we spoke about identity. And we spent today talking about emotion. Now, I'd like to show you something that completely changed the way I understood human performance. Because here's what I learned. The domains of performance never operate in isolation. They're consistently interacting with one another. So think about that. Identity is talking. Emotions are talking. Your thoughts are talking. Your relationships are talking. Your environment is talking. So the question isn't whether those conversations are happening. The question is who's leading. I think that's one of the most overlooked questions in performance, because most people assume performance is determined by knowledge. I don't. Performance is determined by leadership, internal leadership. Okay. Who's going to get your final vote? So think about that. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever known exactly what the right decision was and still not want to make it? Of course you have. Every one of us has. You knew you needed to apologize. You didn't want to. You needed to forgive. You didn't feel like it. You needed to exercise. You didn't have the motivation. You knew you shouldn't have sent that text, but you sent it anyway. The question is why? Because identity and emotion don't always agree. When they disagree, performance is determined by which one becomes the leader. I don't think most people ever thought about this in life. Identity answers one question. Who have I decided to become? Emotions answers another. How do I feel right now? Notice, neither one of them is wrong. They're simply answering different things. Identity is future oriented. Emotion is present oriented. Identity asks, what is consistent with my purpose? Your emotions ask, what would bring me relief right now? Both deserve a voice. Neither should be ignored, but only one should lead. So let's make this practical. Suppose your identity says, I've committed to my marriage. That's what you've decided to become. The decision's been made. Then one day your spouse says something that deeply hurts, and then, you immediately, your emotions going to start talking right away. I'm angry. They don't deserve kindness. They don't understand how badly they hurt me. Identity quietly responds, no, it's not what we decided to become. Now here's the question. Who leads? Not who's first to speak. Now, who's the loudest? Who leads? Because your answer determines your performance. Your identity says, I'm building this business because I believe it serves people. Your emotions will tell you that you're exhausted. Your identity is going to tell you that we're builders. But your emotion says, I can't do this anymore. Identity says we've overcome difficult seasons before. But your emotions are going to tell you right away, I don't want this pressure. I don't want this pressure anymore. I just want it to stop. So who leads? Your identity says that you're a leader, but your emotions say, I don't really like confrontation. Your identity says that leaders have difficult conversations. Your emotions say, what if they don't like me? What if this destroys my relationships? So the question is, who leads? Your identity says, I'm committed to my health. Your emotions are going to tell you that key lime pie is looking mighty delicious. Identity says we're building a healthier future. Your emotions say, it's a hard day. You deserve it. So who's going to lead? Your identity says that I'm a follower of Christ. Your emotions say, I want revenge. Your identity just tells you to forgive. But your emotions say, they don't deserve it. They don't deserve my forgiveness. I don't even like them. Identity says, pray for them. But your emotions are going to tell you a different story. I hope they experience exactly what they did to me again and again and again. So who's leading in those moments? Do you see what's happening? This isn't about marriage. It's not about leadership. It's not about health. It's not even about your faith. It's about your leadership, that internal leadership, because every decision that you make is a leadership decision between the domains. Let that sink in. I think that this may become one of the more important statements in this performance capacity framework. Performance is the visible outcome of whichever domain is leading in that moment. Let that settle for just a second. Performance isn't simply behavior. Performance reveals leadership. If emotions are leading, your behavior will reflect emotions. If identity is leading, your behavior will reflect identity. Every decision exposes which domain has the final vote. Most people believe emotions destroy identity. Well, I don't. I think weak identity gives emotions too much authority. That's a very different statement. Healthy identity doesn't eliminate fear. Healthy identity simply refuses to let fear become their CEO. So think about an organization. If the CEO leaves office for a month, someone else started making the decisions, the organization didn't stop working. Okay. The leadership just simply changed. Your life works the same way. When your identity isn't leading, something else will. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's anger. Sometimes it's loneliness. Sometimes it's shame. Sometimes it's, seeking after comfort. Sometimes it's your pride. That gets in the way a lot. The question is never whether life has a leader. The question is, who have you promoted to CEO today? That takes me back to something, in last week's discussion. The grasshopper fascinates me, not because it jumps, because of why it jumps. The grasshopper doesn't jump toward purpose. It jumps away from discomfort. It jumps away from stimulus. It's just jumping after stimulus. It's jumping again and again and again after stimulus, after stimulus, after stimulus. It never stops to ask, where am I trying to go? It only knows one thing. I want out. Its mission isn't purpose. Its mission is relief. I think that's how many people live their lives. Business get difficult. They jump. The marriage gets uncomfortable. They jump. Somebody makes a Facebook post. They jump. They respond. Leadership becomes emotionally expensive. They jump. Somebody criticizes you. They jump. Every time your pressure increases, you're going to jump. If another opportunity appears, are you going to jump? You going to jump again? Movement becomes, mistaken for progress. But movement isn't always progress. Sometimes it's simply another emotional reaction. Low emotional capacity produces grasshopper living, not because people are weak, but because emotions have become the leader. High performers don't eliminate emotions. They simply refuse to let emotions determine their direction. They ask a different question. They don't ask, how do I escape this feeling? Instead, they ask, what moves me closer to my goal, closer to my purpose? That becomes emotional capacity. Now imagine two circles. One is identity, the other is emotion. Where those circles overlap, that's where performance lives. Every important decision you make happens inside of that overlap. Healthiest people don't ignore emotions. They don't suppress them. They don't pretend they're not there. They allow their identity to interpret that, what their emotions saying. I think this may be one of the more important sentences we've discussed today. Identity gives emotional context. So let's say that again. Your identity gives your emotions context. And without identity, emotion is going to interpret everything alone. Fear says run, anger says attack. Okay, that's not what we should be. Your discouragement is going to tell you to quit. Your loneliness says that you should settle. How many times are we settling in life? Without identity, those emotions become your reality. Without healthy identity, okay, emotion still speaks. But identity explains what those emotions actually means. Fear becomes preparation. Anger becomes investigation. Discouragement becomes perseverance. Loneliness becomes an invitation to healthy connection rather than unhealthy compromise. The emotion didn't disappear. The interpretation changed. Identity gave emotion context. Jesus demonstrated this perfectly in the Garden of Gethsemane. Scriptures tell us how he was deeply distressed. He experienced anguish, sorrow. His emotions, they didn't disappear. They were fully present, but his identity never changed. I came to do the will of my Father. Same person, two domains, identity, emotion. His identity led. His emotions followed. Now look at Peter. Peter loved Jesus. Every identity was genuine. But for one painful moment, fear became louder than his identity. Emotion became the leader, and his behavior followed. He denied the one he loved 3 times. His identity didn't disappear. His leadership changed. And that's why Peter's story gives us, one of hope. Because failure doesn't always mean you lost your identity. Sometimes it simply means another domain temporarily became the leader. Growth is learning how to restore the right leader. Every day, identity and emotion have a little conversation. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they don't. The quality of your performance depends on who has the final vote. Okay, not who has the loudest voice. The loudest voice is usually emotion. The wisest voice should be identity. And when identity consistently leads emotion, your performance begin to reflect in your purpose instead of your circumstances. That's emotional capacity. Now, next week, we will be introducing the third domain, cognitive capacity. And by the end, you will have a more complete picture of what's, between where you are and the life that you've imagined. If you've enjoyed this series so far, especially if you stayed tuned this long, do me a favor, share this podcast with someone who needs to hear it. The second ask of you is to let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your stories, your examples, your questions. We're building a place where we can move from pain to purpose. The link is in the description on how to get in touch with me. So until next week, thank you for watching Empowerment with Dr. Lawrence. I'll see you next week.